My name is Todd Breyfogle, and I direct the seminars program at the Aspen Institute with the primary responsibility for the classic Mortimer Adler Great Book Seminar for Corporate Executives. This is an opportunity for people from all walks of life, leaders in government, business, nonprofit sector, to come together over the course of a week and read the classic texts of not just Western civilization, but human civilization, Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Confucius, Mencius, literature. And it allows them an opportunity to engage in three conversations simultaneously. First, the conversation with the ages, as we like to describe it, thinking through the human predicament in the company of the great thinkers of human civilization. Secondly, it's an opportunity for them to engage in a conversation among themselves. There's no point in putting 20 fantastically accomplished and bright people in the same room and then have one supposedly bright person talk at them. So we use a Socratic discussion method in which participants learn as much from each other as they do from the texts and from the moderators themselves. But then lastly, we like to talk about the internal conversation, the conversation in which we ask ourselves, am I living responsibly? What are my obligations? How do I think about fundamental human values in the way in which I lead my organization, or the way in which I'm a parent or a spouse or even a child? And this really gets to the core, I think, of what humane or a liberal education is, where we're in conversation with one another. We're thinking about the historical arc of our own existence, but then also recalibrating so that when we make decisions, we make them more humanely, we make them more efficiently, but ultimately they're informed by a profound sense of what it means to be human. Very often, the executives that we work with will say, it's the tough decisions that rise to the top. When you make a tough decision, they'll often say you need to do two things. You need to know yourself, and you need to know the people that you're working with. And so the executive seminar, the Aspen Seminar on Leadership, Values, and the Good Society, is really an opportunity for people, as I said, from all walks of life, to recalibrate, to think about their moral compass, and to know themselves so that when they make the difficult decisions, they can do so with confidence and with a clear conscience. It's a very strange approach, I think, to executive education, but it's one that's been informed by 60 years of tradition, started by Mortimer Adler and Robert Hutchins from the University of Chicago. And it literally transforms the way people think and act in the world. So it's a wonderful intersection of thought and action that, again, I think embodies that spirit of liberal education, whereby we understand what it means to live responsibly and thoughtfully in the world.
Great. And now if you'll tell us a little bit about eccentricity and liberal education, the topic of your talk tonight at our Book Awards Center.
Eccentricity and liberal education. This really started as I thought about all of the teachers who have been important in my life. Not that they've all been eccentric, but there's all been something, each of them has had some passionate individuality to the way in which they think about the world or the way in which they approach texts. And I suppose I began thinking about it initially when I read a collection of essays by the Irish fiction writer William Trevor. He had a wonderful book in which he described in these little vignettes a number of the teachers he'd had over the years. And there was one, I think, a classics teacher who was always the perfect model of the absent-minded professor. And there was a wonderful description of this man who died when he stepped off the platform in a train station into a train that wasn't there. And Trevor writes, and so he lived as he died somewhere else at the time, which got me thinking about the ways in which knowledge possesses us each in a unique way. And I think one of the reasons that eccentricity, what I'm calling eccentricity, is so important is that in our day of standardization, of the demands for quantitative assessment, that if we lose that sense of passionate individuality, we lose those elements that really draw us out of ourselves and into conversation with the past, into conversation with other people. So one way of thinking about this is that a liberal education should be slightly orthogonal to the world. Otherwise, we're at risk of falling into an intellectual and moral complacency, where we're simply running in parallel with ordinary life, rather than being slightly at odds with it. And I think one of the things that I saw in the 3 books that are being recognized tonight, the 3 authors who are being recognized, is that each of them brought that sense of passionate individuality and intensity to their subjects. We don't redefine a subject in a disciplinary context if we simply follow the traditional models. It's when we rethink things and recombine different approaches that the lenses of our approach to knowledge change, and we're able to see in sharper relief facts that may have already been there, but that haven't been arranged in quite the same way. And so, again, I wouldn't say that our 3 authors are necessarily eccentric, but their books make a mark because they are slightly at odds with the ways in which their subjects have been traditionally treated. And that, I think, expands our imagination. It makes us excited, not only about learning, but also to, they also challenge us to think freshly about the subjects that they have approached. And each of them in their own way talk about what it means to use scholarship to help us live responsibly. And that is, again, I think, to be ever so slightly at odds with the world.
So academia for a long time was sort of the environment of white men from wealthy families, and they were the ones who had the luxury to live a life of the mind. Mm-hmm. And from such a homogenous group, what do you have to say about the fact that so many of the great thinkers and these people who are very liberally minded, great critical thinkers, are at odds with the body of their, the population that they're a part of? Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting question. I mean, we're very accustomed to thinking, or we have been traditionally accustomed to thinking primarily within our Western inheritance. As I think about the great books, I actually tend to shift the terminology a little bit and have recourse to something that the literary critic George Steiner said many years ago. He refers not to the great books, but to classic texts. And a classic text for him is not a text that we read, it's a text that reads us. And one of the things that I like about that notion that a classic text is something that reads us is that it removes the discussion from a particular canon that might be attached to a specific intellectual tradition, and really recalibrates our approach to say, where there are things that challenge us, we should read them. The fact is that Plato and Aristotle, although they are in our tradition, are actually quite foreign to the way we think now. So they challenge us, but in the same way Confucius or Mencius challenges us, or Wole Soyinka from Nigeria will challenge us to think differently about who we are, because they open up a world. They transform our imaginations so that we can view ourselves, as it were, from outside. So I think one of the things that we're seeing now is a recognition that that classic works exists in almost all times and almost all places. And at the same time, there's something to be said for learning our own tradition, because I think we're better prepared to appreciate the intellectual and moral structures of other traditions if we have some knowledge of our own, in the same way that a knowledge of English, for example, will enable us to have a greater sense of the grammatical similarities and differences, but also vocabulary and expressions in French or Romanian, for example. So I tend to think about texts and cultures in a conversational way, that no one has any particular claim to what Mortimer Adler and Robert Hutchins called the great conversation. And in this, I think I'm distancing myself a little bit from the very clear focus that they had on the West. But I think it's very much in keeping with what Hutchins and Adler were trying to do, and that is to re-stimulate more critical thinking, to encourage people to reflect on the ends that we're trying to pursue and not simply the means to the end. And coming back to the work that Hutchins and Adler started at the Aspen Institute in 1950, they recognized that American leaders in particular, but I think the modern sensibility of thought and action was informed by an almost exclusively technical understanding of what it meant to be educated. We have great technical sophistication, but what we don't always have is a humane sensibility about how to learn to use that technology well, because technology can be used for good or for ill. So an emphasis on skills, however important it is, has to be complemented by a clear sense of what it means to be human, what it means to ask humane questions, and what it means to make humane decisions. And we do that by being in conversation, not just with our own tradition, however important that is, but also with expressions of humanity from other times and other places that might be less familiar. And in so doing, we find that, for example, putting Aristotle in conversation with Confucius challenges us to think differently, not only about ourselves, but also about what we think is our tradition as distinct from someone else's. Because as human beings, we collectively, I think, particularly now in an era of globalization, are trying to come to terms with what it means to navigate values across cultures, and whether it might be possible to settle on common values that will help us be united with one another rather than being at odds with one another. That sounds idealistic, perhaps, but it seems to me that any education worth its salt needs to focus on what might be as well as what actually is.